I don't need to talk to this audience, I don't think, about the extraordinary accomplishments of this pontificate. The reclamation of the papacy as an evangelical and pastoral office of witness in the church and for the world. The authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council as a spirit-inspired effort to get the church to think again about itself on the threshold of its third millennium as a great evangelical movement in history. The Pope's pivotal role in the collapse of European communism, another great accomplishment. The Pope's identification shortly after that of the many challenges facing free societies, democracies, old and new, in that magnificent encyclical Centesimus Annus. The Pope's ecumenical efforts, which have positioned the Catholic Church not on the periphery, but at the center of the quest for Christian unity in the world. The Pope's extraordinary efforts in bringing Christians and Jews to a level and depth of conversation perhaps not seen for more than 1900 years. The Pope's outreach to other world religions and the worlds of science, in the calm conviction that truths from whatever source all point to the one truth, capital T, who is God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. The Pope's theology of the body, the most comprehensive, compelling, coherent Christian response to the sexual revolution ever articulated. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, a remarkable statement that 2,000 years into its history, the Catholic Church could still give in a comprehensive and compelling and coherent and very long book, an account of what the author of the first letter of Peter referred to as the hope that is within us. And of course, what all of you represent here tonight, I think, the extraordinary inspiration that this one life has given to so many hundreds of millions of lives around the world. Had we not had the past 10 days that we've had, it might be of some interest to probe those accomplishments in a little more detail. But given the past 10 days that we have had, which I don't think are a prelude to an immediate calling home of the Holy Father to glory, but do remind us that all good things, even this great and good thing, will eventually come to an end. I thought it might be of particular interest tonight to share some thoughts with you on what are the great issues facing the Church in the early 21st century, how those issues will bear on what I have called somewhere else the work that John Paul II will leave the rest of us to do, despite his own immense labors, and how the way in which the Church grapples with those large issues will have effects not only on Catholics, but indeed on the world civilization of the 21st century. So I want to talk a bit about the future tonight, rather than about the past. It may help at the outset to quickly summarize, in a way that's probably not necessary for this group, what the issues for the Church in the next conclave and in the 21st century are not. Neither the next conclave nor the next pope is going to change the Catholic Church's teaching on the morally appropriate way to regulate births, although the cardinals may well discuss how to present that teaching with greater pastoral effectiveness. Neither the next conclave nor the next pope is going to endorse abortion on demand or euthanasia. The inviolability of innocent life is a bedrock principle of both natural and revealed law, and the Church has no authority to declare the use of lethal violence against innocents morally justifiable. Similarly, while the pre-conclave conversations among senior churchmen and the conclave itself may involve some discussion of the effects of the revolution in women's lives and the concurrent revolution in men's lives on the Church and the world, the Church's practice of calling only men to the ministerial priesthood is not going to change, because as John Paul II stated 11 years ago, the Church is not authorized to change that practice. I think there will likely be some discussion of the advisability of ordaining viri probati, proven and tested older married men, to the ministerial priesthood in situations where the shortage of priests is drastically impeding the Church's sacramental life. But the cardinals who will elect the next pope well know that this solution, if it in fact be a solution, will create some problems as well as address others, and we need not expect, nor from my point of view should we want, a full-scale retreat from the ancient linkage of celibacy and ordained ministry in the Catholic Church. All of which is to say that virtually all of what the New York Times imagines are the issues for the Catholic Church aren't in fact the issues and aren't going to play a significant role in shaping the next conclave, the next pontificate, and the Church in the 21st century. So what are the issues? Three large-scale issues are, I believe, already under discussion within the College of Cardinals and among other senior churchmen, and will certainly weigh heavily in the conclave's deliberations, in the next pontificate, and in the Catholic Church's interface with the 21st century world. The first of these is the virtual collapse of Christianity in its historic heartland, Western Europe. The second great issue is the Church's response to the multifaceted challenge posed by the rise of militant Islam. And the third involves the questions posed by the biotech revolution. Questions of the Church's intellectual discipline will also be on the table in the immediate future, I believe, and I hope to show in a moment why those questions, properly understood, are of considerable consequence for the culture as a whole, not simply for the Catholic Church. Then there is a question that may or may not come up in the pre-conclave discussions, the general congregations of cardinals that will begin to meet after the Pope's death, and the conclave deliberations of the cardinal electors, but which, in my judgment, should be addressed. And that is the question of the Church's diplomacy, or to be more precise, the set of ideas that have guided the foreign policy of the Holy See for more than 2 generations now. Let me address each of these briefly, without by any means exhausting each topic, but drawing out some of the implications embedded within each of those issues. First of all, Europe. Those of you who read First Things may be familiar with the article I published about a year ago called Europe's Problem, in which I proposed a culture-first analysis of Europe's current political crankiness, and particularly of the critical problem of European depopulation. And I traced the origin of these problems to the triumph of what the great mid-20th century Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac called atheistic humanism in the high culture of 19th century Europe. An atheistic humanism that displaced the God of the Bible in the name of human liberation. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was right, I suggested in that article, when he argued that Europe's disastrous 20th century had taken place because men had forgotten God and had imagined the possibility, indeed the imperative, of politics without God. The worst material effects of what Father de Lubac called atheistic humanism were defeated in 2 world wars and the Cold War. But the residues of atheistic humanism, now expressed in the kinder, gentler phenomenon that Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls exclusive humanism, that is, a humanism committed to keeping all transcendent moral reference points out of public life, are much in evidence today. Those residues were evident when the European Constitutional Treaty, signed this past October, willfully denied that 1,500 years of Christian history had anything to do with contemporary Europe's commitments to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Those residues were evident when Rocco Buttiglione, a man who would have been considered an adornment of any sane government between the days of Cato the Elder and, this past November, was denied an opportunity to serve as European Minister of Justice, not because of his public commitments and record, but because of his personal convictions, informed by both natural law and Catholic moral theology about the morality of homosexual acts and the nature of marriage. Those residues have been evident in the recent controversy in Britain over Ruth Kelly's service as Education Secretary in the Blair cabinet, during which, as the Times of London put it, some MPs, members of Parliament, fear that her religion may cloud her judgment. Her religion being a robust Catholicism, and her judgment, which Miss Kelly believes is informed, not clouded, by Catholic faith, being on matters of embryo-destructive stem cell research. They were evident, those residues, when a leading British newspaper warned this past fall that Christian churches will forfeit what little moral leadership they now enjoy if they do not recognize that tolerance, by which the paper in question means the moral approbation of any sexual activity between any configuration of, and perhaps indeed any number of, consenting adults, is more important than the church maintaining the historic and biblical integrity of its teaching. Apostasy is not the only storyline of 19th and 20th century Europe. There is also a history of Christian renewal movements, tremendous Christian missionary energy, and Christian martyrdom to be conjured with in assessing Europe's immediate past and immediate future. But for the moment, the apostates, those exclusive humanists who believe that only a Europe neutral between worldviews, as Jürgen Habermas and the late Jacques Derrida put it, is safe for human rights and democracy, those apostates have won. They have won in part because of the collapse of Europe's Christian communities as effective transmitters of the faith and effective public advocates for religiously informed moral reason. No pope in history has been more of a pan-European than John Paul II. No pope in history invested more time, intellectual energy, and personal struggle in calling Europe back to the promises of its baptism. And while the seeds that John Paul has planted may well flower in the future, especially among today's younger Catholics, the critical moment for Europe is likely to come in the next 20 or 30 years, precisely because of its demographic suicide. Will a depopulating Europe, incapable of taking the hard political decisions that would prevent fiscal chaos and social catastrophe, and increasingly beset from within by an assertive Islamic minority that sees in 21st century Europe an opportunity to reverse the defeat of 1683, will that Europe become, as Neil Ferguson, Bernard Lewis, and Bat Yeor have warned, Eurabia, an extension of the culture and politics of the Arab Islamic world? What would it mean for the Christian world of the 21st century if its historic heartland were to go the way of the seven churches to whom St. John wrote the book of Revelation? If, in other words, European Christianity of the late 21st century looks a lot like the Christianity of Asia Minor today. Eurabia would, of course, pose enormous strategic and economic problems for the United States and the rest of the democratic world. But even absent such a draconian finish to the story, Europe's current apostasy, which carries with it not an indifference to biblical religion, but an antipathy toward it, is already hurting the United States. The import into the United States of European legal ideas deeply shaped by exclusivist humanism is already making a mark in our federal courts, notably in the 2003 decision, Lawrence versus Texas, which continued and indeed intensified the court's definition of freedom as personal willfulness, period. Today and tomorrow, then, Americans and all free peoples have a stake in whether Europe's current sad decline can be reversed. And thus we all have a stake in whether the only plausible candidate for leading such a reversal, namely an evangelically revived and culturally formative Christianity, in fact emerges in the next 2 generations. How that might happen is beyond our scope here tonight. Finding ways to make it happen is one of the great issues for the Catholic Church that John Paul II will someday leave behind. A capacity to jumpstart the re-evangelization of Europe will be one of the qualities I believe the cardinal electors will seek in the next pope. Whether they find such a man will have a lot to do with how the rest of the 21st century looks for all of us. Then there is the question of Islam. If one looks at the church in global terms, as the cardinal electors must, one cannot help but notice a jagged arc of conflict that runs from the west coast of Africa eastward, ending in Southeast Asia at East Timor. Jagged arc of conflict is perhaps too mild a term, however, for the regions south and north of that globe-spanning dividing line are like 2 enormous tectonic plates grating on each other, with the occasional bloody upheavals that such geologic collisions sometimes produce. North of the dividing line are societies and cultures increasingly swayed by militant forms of Islam. South of that dividing line are Christian communities that, from Nigeria through Sudan to Pakistan and on into the Philippines and Indonesia, are often under assault from their Muslim neighbors and or the governments those neighbors accept. The Catholic Church's religious and theological dialogue with the worlds within worlds of Islam was shaped in the mid-1960s at the end of the Second Vatican Council, a time of buoyant, some might say overly buoyant, optimism in the Church, and a time of relative calm in the Islamic world. The latter has now changed dramatically, in no small part because of strains of Islam influenced by the Islamic Brotherhood, the Wahhabi sect, and other proponents of cultural aggression, civic intolerance, and too often violence in the name of the one God and his one prophet. The conflicts engendered by these changes have been evident along the fault line running from Senegal to East Timor for more than a decade. After 9/11 and the Bali, Istanbul, and Madrid bombings, it should now be clear that this conflict is global in scope. That suggests that the dialogue between Catholicism and the multifaceted Islamic world must also change dramatically, which is to say that the Catholic-Islamic dialogue in the immediate future must be framed from the Catholic point of view in frankly strategic terms, if it is not to degenerate into yet another form of political correctness with unhappy consequences for both the Church and the world. To put the case for strategy most simply, can the Catholic Church be of some modest assistance to those Islamic scholars, lawyers, and religious leaders who are working, often at great risk, to develop a genuinely Islamic case for religious toleration in something approximating what we in the West call civil society? If a world safe for diversity and pluralism requires 1 billion Muslims to become good secular liberals, then we really do face the grim prospect of a global clash of civilizations. Thus, one crucial question for the Islamic future, from the vantage point of the Catholic Church, and I dare suggest for free societies throughout the world, is whether Islam can find within its own sacred texts and legal traditions the internal resources to ground an Islamic case for important facets of the free and virtuous society, including religious tolerance and a commitment to the method of persuasion in politics. Some may wonder whether the Catholic Church has anything of particular interest to bring to this discussion. What it has to offer, I suggest, is its own recent history. For it took the Catholic Church until 1965 to develop and articulate in an authoritative way a thoroughly Catholic concept of religious freedom and its implications for the organization of public life. Indeed, one can draw a rough, very rough, analogy between pro-civil society Islamic scholars and religious leaders today and those Catholic intellectuals and bishops who were probing towards some sort of intellectual rapprochement with religious freedom and democracy as the Ancien regime was crumbling in Europe throughout the 19th century. There may be lessons to be learned from this experience, which eventually led to a dramatic development of social doctrine in Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom, lessons that could and should be brought into the Catholic Church's global dialogue with the multifaceted worlds of Islam. Because of its legitimate concern for imperiled Christian communities in Islamic-dominated lands, on the one hand, and a rather anodyne approach to interreligious dialogue on the other, the Vatican has been reluctant these past 40 years to press its Islamic interlocutors to condemn terrorism forthrightly and publicly. But surely the cardinal electors, well aware of the threat that aggressive and militant forms of Islam pose to the world church, will want to examine this reluctance carefully and consider whether a more forthright approach to manifest aggression is not in order, not least because militant Islam seems to be most aggressive where it perceives weakness. Should the cardinals also agree that the next pontificate must fashion a new strategic approach to the Catholic Church's relationship with its Islamic interlocutors, this would in turn require a change in the client-centered approach to this relationship that has in recent decades dominated the Islamic work of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in Rome. The point, it would seem, is not to be in dialogue with everyone. The point is to be in dialogue with those Islamic partners best positioned to leverage needed change in their co-religionists' understanding of Islam's role in public life. There are, of course, no guarantees that a new strategic approach to the Catholic-Islamic dialogue will have the desired effects within the Islamic world, given the multiple other pressures at play. Nor am I suggesting that new forms of interreligious dialogue are in and of themselves the answer to the worldwide threat of militant Islam. They may well be part of the answer, however. Putting them into play is an urgent task for the Church and for the world, a task not only for the next pontificate, but for those that follow it in this century and perhaps beyond. Then there is the biotech revolution. Like not a few of us, many cardinal electors have the sense that the world has, at best, a 10 to 20-year window in which to build the legal and regulatory structures necessary to channel humanity's new genetic knowledge and its marriage to technology in directions that will lead to healing and genuine human flourishing, rather than to Aldous Huxley's nightmare of the brave new world. The cardinal electors will also be aware, as many of us are, that the dominant public moral vocabulary for wrestling with the issues posed by the biotech revolution is a popularized form of utilitarianism. Does it work? A utilitarianism reinforced by misplaced notions of compassion on the one hand, and by scientific hubris on the other. Changing the grammar and vocabulary of the biotech revolution debate is thus an urgent issue for both the Church in the world and the next generation. How might the Church address this? Perhaps the greatest contribution the Catholic Church can make to this debate is to demonstrate how careful moral reasoning on the biotech issues, far from being an imposition of sectarian values on a pluralistic society, as one presidential candidate recently insisted, in fact contributes to a morally serious theory and practice of democracy. In the 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, John Paul II alerted the world to the dangers inherent in a purely instrumental or mechanical view of democracy. In the 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor, he suggested that a robust public moral culture, recognizing the moral truths inscribed in the human condition, is essential in defending such bedrock democratic principles as equality before the law, as well as in managing passions and interests, fighting corruption, and maintaining democratic inclusiveness. In the 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Pope demonstrated how legalized regimes of abortion and euthanasia, by placing certain classes of human beings outside the protection of the law, threatens the very moral structure of the democratic project. Can the Church develop these insights into a public moral language capable of challenging the utilitarianism that dominates debate on the culture of life questions today? To take one important example, Catholicism proposes a dignitarian view of the human person and challenges certain biotechnological procedures, including cloning, on the moral grounds that they violate the innate human dignity of persons. What precisely is the content of that human dignity? What are its component parts? How is it violated by certain practices? What are the effects for democracy of these violations? John Paul II has given us a supple, rigorous framework for reflection on these questions. It is imperative that the Church, in conversation with all those who recognize the dangers in a purely utilitarian approach to devising the human future, begin to fill in that framework in order to shift the terms of the public moral debate. For more than 2 decades now, the Catholic Church throughout the world has argued that abortion is not a question of sexual morality, but of public justice, a question of the 5th commandment, not the 6th. In the next pontificate, and with the biotechnology challenge compounding the challenge of the abortion license and euthanasia, the Church's social doctrine must demonstrate ever more specifically and persuasively how the protection of innocent life is a first principle of justice without which democracy will self-destruct. The next pontificate and the Church in the 21st century must, in other words, demonstrate ever more persuasively that the life issues are public issues with immense public consequences and not simply matters of individual choice. If the Church does that, it will further advance the cause of a richer, nobler theory of democracy, which is also, by the way, crucial in facing the challenge of militant Islam. Then there is the question of the Church's intellectual life. Claims for Pope Paul VI notwithstanding, John Paul II has in fact been the first modern pope, if by that term we mean a pope with a thoroughly contemporary intellectual formation. Thus, the charge that this has been a pontificate against modernity is frankly absurd. Rather, this has been a pontificate advancing an alternative modern reading of modernity, one in which the West's passage through the 19th century does not necessarily lead to a postmodern skepticism about the human capacity to know the truth of anything. Faith and reason, John Paul II wrote in 1998, are like 2 wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. The quest for truth, the Pope proposed, is innate in us. To deny it is to deny an essential characteristic of our humanity, and the result of that stubborn denial is a stunted humanism eventually trapped in the prison of solipsism. If we want to see the public effects of infidelity toward reason and deeply embedded skepticism about reason's capacity to know the truth of things with a measure of real clarity, we need look only to Europe, where, as Orthodox theologian David Hart has put it, a once great civilization is dying of metaphysical boredom. Voltaire would undoubtedly be shocked at the thought of the Catholic Church as defender of the rights of man. How much more would Voltaire be shocked by the idea of Catholicism as defender of reason? Yet that is the fact of the matter. Alone among major Western culture-forming institutions, the Catholic Church still believes that human beings can know what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful, even if we can never know those exhaustively. And thanks to the intellectual initiatives of John Paul II, the Church can, if it has the will for it, defend those claims in thoroughly modern terms. If it has the will for it is, of course, the crux of the matter. Critics, and in some cases die-hard opponents of John Paul II's intellectual project, critics who cannot seem to grasp that this is not a pontificate against modernity, but a pontificate with an alternative modern reading of the human condition, remain firmly in control of Catholic intellectual centers throughout much of Western Europe and North America, which, among other things, suggests that the notion of this being a repressive pontificate is a tad overwrought. Younger scholars, however, on both sides of the Atlantic, seem more eager to take up the challenge posed by John Paul II than their elders, many of whom seem stuck in intellectual grooves forged in the late 1960s. Will the next pontificate and the next pope, and indeed the Church throughout the 21st century, actively encourage these younger scholars in their commitment to extending the John Paul II project? Will the Church in the 21st century move more assertively to ensure that Catholic institutions of higher education are disenthralled from the snares of exclusivist humanism in order to more effectively develop the alternative, which is Christian humanism? If militant Islam is a serious threat to the future of the West and to free societies throughout the world, so is militant irrationality, or perhaps better, militant post-rationality. The renewal of Western culture, which is essential to the defense of the democratic project, requires a new confidence in reason, a new confidence that we can know and defend certain truths about the dignity of man and about the free and just society. Whether the next pope and the next generation of Catholic intellectuals successfully builds on the legacy of John Paul II in challenging modernity to a richer, nobler concept of itself has important consequences for all of Western civilization and for the course of history. Those four large-scale issues, the Christian collapse in Europe, the Islamic challenge, the biotech revolution, and the revitalization of Catholic intellectual life, will almost certainly be among the questions shaping the deliberations that produce the next pope. In my judgment, a further large question should be added to the mix, and that is the question of the Vatican's address to world politics. Is it not time, for example, to revisit the terms of the Holy See's embrace of international and regional organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union? During the debate prior to the Second Iraq War, senior officials of the Holy See made the argument that the UN Security Council was the sole agency capable of morally legitimating the resort to armed force in world politics. Thanks to the Dulfer Report and congressional investigations, we now know that at precisely the time this claim was being made, members of the Security Council were blindly or willfully oblivious to or complicit in the largest financial scandal in human history, the Iraq Oil for Food program, which in fact worked both to rearm the Saddam Hussein regime and to corrupt the Security Council's deliberations on Iraq. Surely the time has come to raise the question of whether this and a host of other problems at the UN are systemic, not accidental. The Catholic Church, acting through the instrument of the Holy See, will continue to insist, as it must, that the nation-state is not necessarily the final or ultimate form of human political organization. But unless that insistence is coupled with a serious moral critique of the current corruptions of the UN system, a critique that must hold open the question of whether some other form of international organization is not desirable, then I fear that the Holy See will sound ever more in the 21st century like a somewhat more restrained World Council of Churches, which is to say its voice will cease to have any relevance in these debates. That would be a loss for the Church, but it would also be a considerable loss for the world of the 21st century, which is badly in need of a public moral grammar and vocabulary capable of structuring and disciplining the international debate on international security, human rights, and development issues. The Holy See could help facilitate the development of that grammar and vocabulary if it is prepared to re-examine certain aspects of its position that seem, to some minds at least, more reflective of a conventional European political sentiment than of what was once referred to as Catholic international relations theory. A similar re-examination of the Holy See's default positions might well take place in regard to European integration. The current Vatican default position on the European Union, which was set, like its positions on the UN some 40 years ago, is something like this. And integrating Europe will be forced to ask the question of the sources of its unity. That question can only be answered ultimately by Christianity. Therefore, European Union expansion and the further integration of the Union through a new constitutional treaty create an evangelical opportunity, the opportunity to reverse the centuries-long process of European secularization. Brussels setting out to make the rest of Europe Belgium, in fact, on this scenario, succeeds in making the rest of Europe Poland. It doesn't seem to have worked out that way, however. Brussels, setting out to make the rest of Europe Belgium, is now seeking to impose a soulless secularism as the official ideology of the European Union, a secularism with Orwellian overtones, as international legal scholar Joseph Weiler has observed, because in the name of tolerance, it is remarkably intolerant of Christian conviction in the European public square. Ask my friend Rocco Buttiglione. Or, more to the point, ask why Buttiglione got such tepid support from the Secretary of State of the Holy See during his inquisition last fall. If the Holy See fears that raising its voice in defense of the right of Catholics to bring their philosophically and religiously informed moral convictions into public life will somehow jeopardize its standing in Brussels and Strasbourg, then one has to ask at some point whether the game is worth the candle. We have seen how the default positions in the Church's approach to interreligious dialogue with Islam must be reset. The default positions in the foreign policy of the Holy See require similar re-examination and resetting in the near future. Not, I hasten to add, to align the Holy See more closely with U.S. foreign policy, but rather to retrieve and renew at the level of policy and witness the distinctive discipline of Catholic international relations theory. Its revival, in turn, would mark a significant step in the world's capacity to think through the inescapable moral questions posed by the agitated world politics of the early 21st century. Perhaps the wisest line ever written about John Paul II was written at the beginning of the pontificate by a French journalist, André Froissart, a convert to Catholicism from the fashionable atheism of his intellectual class. After John Paul's clarion call to fearlessness and faith rang out across St. Peter's Square at the inaugural Mass on October 22, 1978, André Froissart wired back to his Paris newspaper, "This isn't a pope from Poland, this is a pope from Galilee." The cardinal electors know that they will be trying to find a worthy successor to a giant, to a man some knowledgeable scholars call the most significant pope of the second millennium of Christian history. One cannot envy the man who succeeds such a colossal figure. Yet for all his personal initiative and boldness, John Paul II has always understood that the Church is far more than the papacy or the Pope. Indeed, one way to sum up his heroic efforts is to see him precisely as the Pope from Galilee, the successor of Peter who summoned his brethren in every corner of the world to live out the meaning of their baptismal consecration, and in doing so to set the world ablaze with the truth, as he challenged 2 million young people to do at World Youth Day in Rome in 2000. John Paul II, in other words, has quite deliberately left a lot of work for the rest of us to do. Thank you.